For those of you who watched my last video, you might recall my mentioning of a film Tampopo and its director Juzo Itami. It single-handedly changed my opinion on surrealism and allowed me to tie the video into a convenient bow. Well, during my research on Itami, I stumbled across his very interesting and heavily publicised war with the Yakuza, one of the largest criminal syndicates in the world and without doubt the largest in his home country, Japan. Take a shot every time I say Yakuza in this video. You will not get far, I promise. Yakuza is not one congregation of people, but rather an umbrella term for all organised crime groups in Japan. In Australia, we often refer to bikies, but we're not talking about one specific group like the Banditos, Hells Angels, or Nomads. It's the same when a Japanese person mentions Yakuza. They're not talking specifically about the Yamaguchi-gumi or the Sumiyoshi Kai. It's a blanket descriptor used when discussing Japanese criminal syndicates. The modern Yakuza have become incredibly powerful, but they weren't always so formidable. Yakuza presence in Japan dates back well before the 17th century, but they were pretty powerless until the end of World War II. After America dropped the second A-bomb on Nagasaki, Japan was in economic and literal ruins. The Yakuza, being the opportunists they were, decided to use this terrible situation to their advantage. As the United States invested in rebuilding Japan, Yakuza gangs took over the black market scene and began building up capital. They used this capital to begin manipulating the masses, taking over neighborhoods and towns. You could draw parallels between the Yakuza post-World War II and the Italian Mafia during Prohibition. Both used terrible situations brought upon by their governments at the time to sway public opinion and convince the people that an alliance with them was the only option. You like this plant? The Yakuza continued to gain cash through extortion and intimidation. This made their membership skyrocket. They gained an incredible amount of power as a byproduct of their now rapidly increasing size. With so much capital and influence, it wasn't long before they switched from manipulating and extorting small local businesses to full-blown corporations and even political figures. In 2014, the largest faction of the Yakuza, the Yamaguchi-gumi, brought in an estimated $6.6 billion in annual revenue, all from such virtuous acts as fraud, drug trafficking, blackmail, and bribery. So, looking at their history, they seem like pretty bad dudes. The Japanese people must consider them a serious nuisance to society. Right? Wrong. Unfortunately, one of the smartest moves the Yakuza ever made was to manipulate and influence public opinion in a way that shifted the narrative about them to a heroic one. Throughout the 20th century, the Yakuza were seen by a majority of the public as fearless avengers, men who wanted to continue to uphold Japan's beloved history of sacrifice and honor started by the samurai. Their motto is help the weak and fight the strong, which is pretty funny because it's pretty much exactly the opposite of what they do. They even use katanas, albeit it's usually only to cut the pinky finger off an insubordinate member who disobeys a superior in their hierarchy. I found it super interesting how deeply the Yakuza culture has affected Japan. What are you doing with my bottle? To this day, it's uncommon for... Must you? Stop it! You're a rat, you know that. To this day, it's uncommon for Japanese people to get tattoos out of fear of being perceived as associated with the Yakuza. I also found it hilarious that in a lot of Western cartoons, characters are drawn with 3 fingers and 1 thumb. I'm not an animator. I assume it's because it's easier than complicating your animations with a 4th finger. But this practice is avoided in Japan because it's well known that people with 3 fingers are that way because they were once an insubordinate Yakuza. Bob the Builder had to be changed and given a 4th finger on each hand by showrunners in Japan to prevent children from thinking he was a criminal underworld figure. One man who didn't buy into the narrative being perpetuated about Yakuza was Juzo Itami. He was known for satirizing Japanese society with his very idiosyncratic style, and in the 90s he'd become so sick of the Yakuza and their demonstrably false representation in the public eye that he set out to change it. In '92, he directed Minbo, or The Gentle Art of Japanese Extortion. The story takes place in the luxurious Europa Hotel, whose management team are racking their brains to try and combat their Yakuza problem. See, the issue is that many different Yakuza clans frequent the hotel. These clans have been bullying staff and other patrons. This bullying is usually some part of a mean-spirited plan to extort money. This extortion operation is extremely successful, and word of its success spreads throughout the Japanese criminal underworld, which in turn makes the Yakuza problem even worse. I should probably water my plant. Give it back. Stop it! Rat. The water is for the plant, not for you. You have water in your bowl. The Hotel Europa is usually home to some sort of summit, a summit that brings in plenty of money. I think it's like a United Nations type deal. This year, however, the hotel owner is told that the summit cannot take place unless the Yakuza infestation is smoked out. It's a classy event, and it would be bad for the summit's reputation to exist alongside criminal gangs. This ramps up the stakes and forces hotel management to set up a crack team. Unsurprisingly, no one wants to join this team. So they force a bellboy called Wakasugi and an accountant called Suzuki to join, and the Anti-Yakuza Command Center is born. Almost immediately after the team is created, their presence is requested in the hotel lobby, where a disturbance is reported. Suzuki convinces Wakasugi to go first with the bribe of an ice cream soda. Yeah, it doesn't go well for the two of them. As the story progresses, Suzuki finds himself between a rock and a hard place, or a Yakuza clan that will only leave him alone after being monetarily incentivized, and a boss who wants him to deal with the Yakuza problem without paying them. There's not a single scene early on where we encounter the Yakuza that they're not depicted as overly aggressive, obnoxiously loud man-children. It gets quite annoying to watch at points, to be honest. The Yakuza continue to mount pressure up against Suzuki, and he begins to lose the plot. The poor guy becomes so stressed that he pisses blood, and it seems like all hope is lost for the hotel. Enter Maharu. She is an absolute weapon. She's also a lawyer who specializes in cases of ECD, or extortion by civil dispute, which just so happens to be the way the Yakuza make money. Maharu gives the Anti-Yakuza Command Center a step-by-step guide of how they can beat these thugs in verbal warfare that they employ in their tactics. This is the part where I believe the real Yakuza in Japan felt that this film was going to cause them difficulty and was a threat to their way of life. The film goes into brief legal terms and explains just how far the Yakuza can go legally before criminal charges can be laid. Maharu sheds light on the fact that most of the stuff these gangs get away with wouldn't be possible if the general public knew how powerless they were in the face of the law. Our team sets up a VIP room, which is a joke about the entitlement of these fools, which I enjoy quite a lot, and they rig it with one clear camera and a lot of hidden ones. In the scene that follows, a group of Yakuza attempt to extort the hotel out of more money, except this time they're brought straight to the VIP room.
正義のためには彼らは懲役に行くことも恐れない。誠に見上げたもんで。女の一人住まいは不用心だ。後々後悔しないようによく考えた方が。
こういうことですか、花岡さん。私が言うこと聞かないと、こういう若い人たちが黙っていない。私に乱暴するだろうと言っておられるわけです。
そんなこと言っちゃおらんよ。
そうよね。そんなこと言ったら脅迫罪になってしまいますもんね。
うるせえ。
そのために港町署の刑事さんにご足労願ってるんですのよ。明智さん、どうぞ。
と債権の取り立てでね、話があったもんで。
債の取り立てじゃお前有名なんだってな。
まあね。
債権の取り立ては弁護士法違反の疑いがある。そりゃちょっと署まで来てもらおうか。
So, I won't spoil any more of the film in case you're planning on watching it. I'd highly recommend it. It's a great film. But why am I even bringing this film up? Well, this film was very successful in Japan in '92. So successful, in fact, that it single-handedly changed public perception of the Yakuza. Rather than being seen as noble modern samurais, they were now seen for the primitive thugs that they were. This was the most realistic depiction of the Yakuza ever put to film, and they hated it and everything it stood for. The part of the film that offended the Yakuza most was the concept that they never came through on their threats. That everything they used as leverage was ultimately superficial and hollow intimidation. Now that they felt their reputation was on the line, they had to make a demonstration. This is super uncomfortable. I'm not doing any more of the video yet. After the film's premiere, Itami's home was patrolled by police every 30 minutes. He seemed to disapprove of this new protection because in a statement he made to the public, he was quoted as saying, "I don't think anything will happen." It was as if he was poking at them, prodding, daring them to do something. "You won't do it. I bet you won't." Well, this was too much for them to take. A few days later, and just a week after the premiere of Mimbo, Juzo Itami was attacked. On Friday, the 22nd of May, 1992, Itami parked his car and began to walk to his apartment building in Tokyo. It was here that he was ambushed by multiple assailants dressed all in black. The assailants attacked him and made slow, deep cuts into his face, shoulders, and arms. They then quickly jumped into a van and fled the scene. Once inside, he was greeted by his wife, Nobuko Miyamoto, who actually plays the kick-ass lawyer in Minbo. She was understandably quite shaken by the situation, especially considering he was covered in blood. Itami peacefully asked her to please calm down and call an ambulance. She obliged. Side note, all the men who attacked him were caught very quickly after and given sentences that range from 4 to 5 years. Alright, it's a new day, and as you can tell, beard is gone. I don't want to talk about it. Let's move on. I thought the shot was really cool out in my living room, but it's just not really practical to shoot in a communal living space when you have 2 other roommates.
If we start gonna make food.
What?
If we start gonna make food. What are you, the big boys? What's a pizza man? What's a pizza man? What's a pizza man?
On the whole shot.
Yeah, Leonard.
You're a dog. This house is a prison. And a dog running around. Hey mate, come here. What's going on? Once at the hospital, he was given emergency surgery. His condition became stable, and somehow he managed to make a statement to the press while recovering from these gashes. His statement was this: "This incident doesn't change anything stated in Minbo. Please continue to fight against the gang." This man was seriously ballsy. He didn't seem to be backing down, and with the unpredictability of both parties involved, no one knew what was going to happen next. This is the part where the timeline gets a little bit murky. The very well publicised attack caused a government crackdown on Yakuza. This led to huge incarceration rates of Yakuza across the country. It seemed that Itami had irreversibly hurt them, and this was the last we heard from them for a while. Oh, and he decided to rub some salt in the wounds by releasing another statement to the press, which said this: "The fact that I was attacked proves that what I pointed out in my film was correct. If I was wrong, they wouldn't have reacted so strongly. I pointed out the truth, and they wanted to stop this information from spreading." A year later, during a screening of Minbo, a 25-year-old known to be associated with a right-wing extremist group slashed the cinema screen. When he was asked about his motivation for committing the act, he said he actively objected to the scene where the Japanese flag is desecrated. The problem with this reasoning is that no such scene exists in the film, so investigators had no idea what he was talking about. Regardless, it seemed Itami's list of enemies was growing. As the years went by, Itami continued to satirize parts of Japanese culture he didn't agree with, creating enemies on both sides of the fence. Jump forward a few more years to 1997, a popular magazine begins writing a hit piece on Itami, uncovering secret information about a supposed affair the director was having, even going as far as to obtain photo evidence of said affair. It seemed Juzo Itami's whole world was about to come crashing down. December 20th, 1997, Juzo Itami's body was found at the bottom of his 8-story office complex. He had jumped. Inside his office was a typed note remarking that he was deeply ashamed. He would be falsely accused of having an affair and he was killing himself to clear his name. 2 days later, the tabloid was published, regardless of him committing suicide, which seems incredibly disrespectful to me. And sure enough, it was damning. His death was ruled a suicide with no evidence of foul play. That was that. Case closed. Except doesn't that all seem a bit sus? Someone else obviously found it a bit sus because his wife was placed under police protection for 20 years after his death. So, if we're so certain that he committed suicide and we're closing the case, why are we protecting his widow? Also, no one who knew Itami believed that he would have committed suicide. He had criticized many aspects of Japanese culture, including honorable suicide, so why would he contradict his own work? You might say, well, what about the note? He typed a note. Isn't it a bit strange to use a computer to type a suicide note? Doesn't that seem a little too prepared for something as impulsive as what suicide usually is? As for the affair, well, his wife and entire family defended him from the very start, saying that these accusations were completely false and slanderous. The magazine contacted Itami days before the publication went live to ask for his side of the story. He declared that he'd been interviewing the woman concerning a film that he was going to be making about office workers. He admitted to giving the woman money to help her with her move, but described it as a kind gesture that was only in exchange for her surrendering such a personal story. As for the photos the magazine had of the supposed affair, well, they were literally photos of Juzo Itami and the woman walking down the street and eating a meal in a public restaurant. I don't believe that requires any explanation, but I'll just say that if you don't believe that a man and a woman can hang out and socialize without there being some sort of sexual connotation underneath, you're a child who lives in a fantasy world. I don't care how much you love the film When Harry Met Sally. Harry's philosophy is ridiculous.
Men and women can't be friends because the sex part always gets in the way.
That's not true. So you're saying that a man can be friends with a woman he finds unattractive?
No, you pretty much want to nail him too.
Well, I guess we're not going to be friends then.
But by far, the strongest piece of evidence against ruling Itami's death a suicide was a 2009 book published by Jake Adelstein in which he interviewed various ex-Yakuza members. He interviewed them about their lives. One man claimed that he was there the night Itami was murdered. He said, and I quote, "We set it up to stage his murder as a suicide. We dragged him up to the rooftop and put a gun in his face. We gave him a choice. Jump and you might live, or stay and we'll blow your face off. He jumped. He didn't live." Now, it's possible this account could be fabricated. Criminal gangs are known to take responsibility for acts they didn't commit in order to appear larger than what they really are. But given Juzo Itami's tumultuous relationship with the Yakuza, doesn't this seem way more plausible than him killing himself to prove innocence? Why would someone kill themselves to prove their innocence? Doesn't suicide seem a little more synonymous with things like shame and guilt? For the sake of this essay, I'm going to assume he was murdered, because I want to explore when and why artists have died for their art. It is once more a new day. I don't know what to tell you. Shooting hasn't been as productive as what I would have wanted. It seems you can kill a man, but ideas are bulletproof. Juzo Itami will always be remembered as the man who changed public perception of the Yakuza and exposed them for the wretched thugs they really are. But when is a cause like this worth dying for? Why do people sacrifice their lives? I believe death is worthwhile when it brings hope. Men and women all throughout history have willingly given up their lives for the sake of hope. Hope is the tiny ember that burns in the fire that seems all but extinguished. Hope is the thought that one day the things that are making me suffer will cease to exist, or I will have developed the strength to overcome them. Hope is not knowing, but having faith that tomorrow will suck less than today did. The hope of a better future is a better reason to die than any other. A truly loving parent would sacrifice themselves for their children, in a heartbeat too. And what is that sacrifice if not the hope of a better future? So if people are willing to die for the hope of a better future, then it's not difficult to wrap your head around the idea that artists who believe their art might make the world a better place or the future a little brighter would sacrifice even their own lives to see that reality through. After all, without some hope, the future wouldn't exist at all. Many of you probably think that the opposite of happiness is sadness or anger. I think that's wrong. To be sad or angry, you have to have something to be sad or angry about, which means you must care about something. The opposite of happiness is hopelessness. When all hope has left you, that's a truly awful situation to be in. Without any hope, we would all die. As terrible as it sounds, if hope didn't exist, everyone would kill themselves. Somewhere, someone is battling suicide right now. And why don't they just go through with it? What's stopping them? Because somewhere in the deepest, darkest depths of their mind, there's a little bit of hope. If that's you, please hang on. That little bit of hope is worth hanging on to, I promise you. The human condition is holding on to that little bit of hope and letting it grow. Sure, it'll expand, it'll shrink throughout your life, but that's just part of being human. Even religious martyrdom is still an act of hope. Sure, it's a little bit more of a selfish act of hope because the better future you're hoping for is in your own afterlife, but it is still an act of hope. While I'm discussing martyrdom in art, it would be foolish of me to not bring up the most notorious case in film history. If the name Pier Paolo Passolini doesn't ring a bell, then surely his masterpiece Salo or the 120 Days of Sodom does. Often dubbed the most controversial film of all time, and yes, I know a lot of films claim that title, but this one may actually deserve it. Sure, there's Cannibal Holocaust, Necromantic, Kubrick's Lolita, Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, Kubrick's Clockwork Orange. Come to think of it, Kubrick made a lot of controversial stuff. Hitchcock's Psycho, Natural Born Killers, Freaks, Taxi Driver. I could go on for hours listing off controversial films. So I'll make an important distinction. All of the films I just listed were controversial because they pissed off a bunch of old white people and made them say in hordes, "Oh, that offended me. The moving images I just watched upset me greatly and I want everyone to know about that." And that was practically the extent of the whole controversy. I think the film that deserves the title of most controversial film of all time is the film that caused the most real-world conflict. There are three that could actually make that claim. The first is Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffith, which was incredibly well made from a technical filmmaking standpoint, but it also portrayed racist behaviours and attitudes as heroic and helped revitalise the Ku Klux Klan. The second is The Last Temptation of Christ, which led to the Vatican stating very publicly how horrible they found it. It also caused some theatres to be firebombed in protest to showing the film, which is still banned in many countries, including the Philippines and Singapore. The controversy is a shame because this is a gorgeous film. Willem Dafoe is brilliant and Scorsese's direction is really spot on. What makes the controversy even more ridiculous is the fact that it's quite well known that Scorsese subscribes to the Catholic faith. The third is Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, for the reasons I'm about to discuss. Side note, this is Gaspar Noé's favourite film. If you know him, that probably says all you need to know about this film. I don't want it to seem like I'm hating on the guy. I actually really enjoy his films, but I don't think anyone's going to argue with me when I say the dude's insane.
One of my very favorite movies ever. I have it on DVD, but I don't have it on Blu-ray, so I'm sure there are extras that I have never seen.
To understand the impact that Salo or the 120 Days of Sodom had on the world, some background on its director is relevant. Salo's director, Pier Paolo Passolini, was also a poet, writer, intellectual, actor, journalist, playwright, and political figure. Pasolini's legacy remains a contentious topic to this day because of the huge amount of controversy he was able to stir up in his very short time in the spotlight. Of course, his artistic endeavours were controversial because of his propensity for writing shocking and macabre pieces, but the real controversy came from his politics. He aligned himself with the Italian Communist Party whilst maintaining his subscription to the Christian faith. This pissed off a lot of people because they believed the two were ideologically dissonant. Passolini openly opposed this dichotomy, defying the notion that communism was contrary to Christian values. And if being a communist and a Christian wasn't enough of a controversy cocktail, he was also a homosexual. I don't agree with his public image being contentious for the simple fact that he was gay, but this was the 70s and the world hadn't quite gotten over its rampant homophobia, so I feel it's appropriate that this be mentioned. Pasolini's style often consisted of juxtaposing socio-political criticisms with an exploration of sexual taboos. For example, in Salo, we see the word that begins with R that I can't mention on YouTube, of a group of prisoners by their captors used as a shocking metaphor to demonstrate the way systems that are fundamentally built on absolute power strip the dignity, power, and worth of the people governed by them. The rest of the film serves as a warning of how that power manifests itself. It's a meditation on the very Orwellian concept that absolute power corrupts absolutely. No doubt, living under Mussolini fueled Pasolini's political opposition to fascism, which the film was attempting to spearhead. What does all this have to do with martyrdom? Well, I'm not referring to martyrdom in its religious form. Rather, in this instance, I'm calling Pasolini a martyr because I believe he died for what he believed in. On the 2nd of November 1975, on a beach in Ostia, Italy, the body of a 53-year-old man was found. The man had been run over multiple times by his own car before being savagely beaten by what was assumed by the coroner to be a metal bar. That same bar had been used to crush his testicles. He had also been covered in petrol and partially burned, but the coroner's autopsy report stated that the covering in petrol and setting alight likely took place post-mortem. The body was positively identified as Pier Paolo Passolini. A 17-year-old prostitute, Giuseppe Pelosi, was caught driving Pasolini's car. Police were suspicious, so they asked him to stop. He did so right away, but as the police approached him on foot, he turned his engine on, attempting to escape. The police followed him for about 700 meters before he lost control and crashed into a wall. He then tried to flee on foot, but was caught. He was arrested and brought in for questioning. Investigators began to understand that Pier had picked up the boy the night of his death. Pelosi soon confessed to Pasolini's murder and was convicted a year later in 1976. And that was that. Case closed. Except, doesn't that seem a bit random? A man with a list of enemies as large as Pasolini was killed by a 17-year-old boy. He'd pissed off religious groups, political parties, and masses of the general public, yet his undoing came from an opportunistic sadist who was a child at the time? And this took place 3 weeks before the premiere of a film he directed that was a scathing critique of a political ideology, one known to be populated by persons unafraid of using brutal violence to further their agenda. I don't think I mentioned that part. He was killed 3 weeks before the world premiere of Salo, and some rolls of celluloid were stolen in the lead up to his death. Almost like an individual, or group of individuals, fascists, felt that this film's existence could harm their reputation and it would be beneficial for their cause if this piece of art ceased to exist, and that the man responsible for its creation was prevented from making any more. Is it a huge stretch that a group known for its authoritarianism would attempt to censor information? I obviously have to preface all of this with the fact that this is all speculation from me, but the verdict states that Pelosi killed the director and had no accomplices. That strikes me as improbable given the way he was executed was long viewed as a mafia-style revenge killing, one extremely unlikely to have been carried out by one person. In fact, forensic examination by Dr. Faustino Durante concluded that Pasolini was the victim of an attack carried out by more than one person. 29 years after he was convicted, on the 7th of May 2005, Pelosi retracted his confession, which he claimed was the product of coercion. According to Pelosi's new version of events, he did not kill Pasolini, it was instead a group of young men with southern accents. He also claimed that 3 men beat him to death on the beach whilst yelling insults such as "dirty communist." Pelosi's reasoning for his own confession was that these same men had threatened violence against his family. This is where the timeline gets murky due to some contradictory accounts. I want to first state that this information is a little untrustworthy because City's only backing to his claims was that he knew a source who knew the truth about the murder. He said, and I quote, "Pino Pelosi was only a boy. He acted as bait for those 5. They only used him. They needed somebody to blame for the crime." Something that struck me as strange was that from all the evidence I read over, City's retelling made way more sense. But there are two glaring issues found when juxtaposing Pino Pelosi and Sergio City's account. The first is the number of perpetrators, and the second is the location where the assassination took place. Pelosi claimed 3 men committed the murder, whereas City claimed his eyewitness saw 5, and Pelosi declared the murder was committed on the beach, whereas City declared the beach was only the dumping ground. And we're back. It's been a really long time since I filmed the last part. It's been so long that I probably need to water my plant again. And I've actually updated my setup in here, so I have a spray bottle now, rather than just sprinkling the plant with a bottle, because I was told that that's probably not the best way to water a plant. This essay has become a gardening tutorial. And I really shouldn't be giving out gardening advice. It's quite hot in here. You're probably wondering why I believe City over Pelosi. I have a few reasons. The most immediately clear is that by Pelosi's account, this extremely sadistic, brutal gang killing took place on a public beach. If you were going to torture then kill a man and attempt to get away with it, why would you do it somewhere you're so likely to be seen? Especially when the person you're killing is an extremely well-known public figure. This also helps City's account because the only witness to have seen what took place said the body was dumped on the beach before the suspected murderers disappeared. The next reason is that Pelosi couldn't give a physical description of the men, he could only recount their voices. That leads me to believe his view was obscured in some way. He had a bag over his head, he was blindfolded, or he was inebriated in some way. This would explain the disconnect in the number of perpetrators. It's possible that Pelosi assumed there was only 3 because he only heard 3 of them talk. It's also possible that in this potentially inebriated state, Pelosi was dumped on the beach beside Passolini. When he came to, his blindfold was taken off and his brain connected the dots. That would explain him believing that Passolini was killed on the beach. Or maybe, if we go back to the blindfold argument, of the 5 killers, only 3 came along for the drive where he was dropped off. The final reason is, through all of my research, the only person to have mentioned a political conspiracy was Sergio City. I think it's certainly in the realm of possibility that no one involved had the guts to speak out about something they believed to be a huge political conspiracy. It would mean certain painful death for anyone who came forward. This would explain why City couldn't name his eyewitness. He did it to protect his or her safety. City either believed he was safer due to his heightened social status, or simply didn't care about his own safety, he just wanted the truth to be known. Now, I want to be absolutely crystal clear. None of what I just said is fact in the slightest. That is simply the best theory I could come up with given the limited information that exists surrounding the case. I should say that one blatant loose end that I was unable to tie up was City's claim of 5 men. If his eyewitness was on the beach and saw the body being dumped, then how did he know that when Passolini was killed elsewhere, the killing was carried out by 5 men? I can't say. There's just not enough information. Italian police obviously felt the same way because the case was reopened after Pelosi's retraction, but the judges responsible for the investigation found that the new elements were insufficient to justify a continued inquiry. Now, if you're a keen viewer, you might have noticed a slight deviation in my usual video style. Usually I would give a summary of the film and provide all the relevant information about its plot. Did I just get lazy? Not exactly. I don't know what to tell you. I'm getting to the end of this essay. I deserve a reward. The reason I haven't really summarized the film or shown any appropriate clips is that almost none of what happens in the film is safe to show or even discuss on YouTube. It's truly a disgusting film. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly got artistic merit. This is not shock factor for the pure sake of shock factor. No, it's all very well justified and held up by some reasonably high quality filmmaking, but this video will be blocked if I discuss Salo in detail. I'm going to explain as much of the plot as I possibly can without getting blocked. Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, is a 1975 art house horror film. Pretentious implications aside, I use the word art house not as an abstract way of categorizing films that contain very cerebral or cryptic themes. No, I'm using the word more concretely. Art house films are typically independent, but not always. They're aimed at niche markets rather than a mass market audience. Often experimental, these films are made primarily for aesthetic reasons rather than commercial profit. I wanted to make the distinction there because I feel like the word art house gets thrown around so much lately that it's become a buzzword rather than an actually valid utilitarian term. So Salo follows 4 affluent libertines. Don't worry if you don't know what that word means. I wasn't actually sure what a libertine was until looking it up for this essay, so if anyone's in the same boat I was in, a libertine is someone completely devoid of any type of morals or sexual restraint. They're basically hedonists if you turn the dial way up. Their pleasure is more important than anything else. If a sociopath were to become a hedonist, you'd call them a libertine. So the libertines kidnap 18 teenagers and subject them to things that I can't mention. The source material Passolini based Salo off was the 120 Days of Sodom by Marquis de Sade. His last name, Sade, is actually where the word sadism comes from, so you can probably imagine the themes we're dealing with here. I'm going to digress into some literature because I feel it's relevant. You guys probably haven't heard of this super underground author George Orwell or his hidden gem of a book that's hardly anyone's ever read called 1984, but I'll tell you about it. In part 3, the main character is being tortured in the Ministry of Love by someone who I won't name because that would be kind of a spoiler for the plot. You're probably thinking, well, isn't the fact that he's being tortured also a spoiler? Yes, a little bit, but I can't make this example without prefacing it with some light spoilers. And it's pretty obvious throughout the book that he's going to end up being tortured. The suspense lies in what he's going to do about it. And is anyone really getting upset about spoilers for a 75-year-old book? Almost 75-year-old book. For the sake of explanation, we'll call this person Redacted. So Redacted is torturing Winston so that he'll confess to crimes that he may or may not have committed. But the issue is that at this point in the book, he's already confessed to everything he's been charged with, and he knows he's going to be executed. So why is he still being tortured? What's the point in continuing to punish someone when you're just going to kill them anyway? I didn't think he'd make an appearance for the rest of the video. Want some wine? What's the point in continuing to punish someone when you're just going to kill them anyway? Redacted says that it's not enough to simply have a prisoner confess. He would confess to anything to make the pain stop. Through psychological manipulation, physical torture, and just a little help from Stockholm Syndrome, Redacted intends to make his prisoners not just confess, but actually believe their confessions, even if it's a complete falsehood. Winston asks why it matters if he believes it or not. After all, he's going to be executed anyway. Redacted responds that Oceania and the whole political party in power cannot and will not allow anyone to act as a martyr. It's never explicitly clarified why the party won't allow martyrdom, but my guess is this. For someone to feel so passionately about one of their beliefs that they would throw away their entire life for it is something hard not to notice. Sure, someone who questions the party and disappears might cause some animosity amongst the populace, but for the most part, anyone being publicly outspoken would be vilified and misrepresented, causing the people to ignore whatever crackpot mumblings led to their vilification. Now imagine someone who spoke out against the party, was told they'd be put to death if they didn't stop, but still refused to be silenced, made it publicly known that they believed the issues they were speaking out against were bigger than themselves. They're then swiftly executed with a balled up fist and a clear conscience. Upon witnessing this very brave act, many people would question, even if just for a second, if the martyr had a point. After all, if they were willing to die, they must have really believed in what they were saying. Maybe they knew something we didn't. This seed of doubt would prick in the back of everyone's mind whenever the party did something remotely questionable in the future. That tiny seed of doubt could grow into rebellion. Or worse, full-blown revolution. It's easy to see how the act of martyrdom could have a tangible effect on the party's future, but this doubt could be flipped. If the potential martyr was successfully tortured back into a patriotic party advocate, then their death would only strengthen the party. That balled-up fist would disappear, in place of a look of regret and sorrow. When even the prisoners being executed show solidarity for the party, the seed of doubt is never planted in the first place. Look, I'm not super aware of the state of Italian politics, but to the best of my knowledge, fascism hasn't returned, and I think we owe that in part to Pasolini's ultimate sacrifice. The party believed to have been behind the racketeering have since dissolved, and Salo remains to be an endearing warning of a part of history we all need to ensure is never repeated. So is art ever worth dying for? Yes, I believe it is. When your art has the potential to make the future a better one, for some or all humans alike, it is worth dying for. If you can avoid dying and still make the future better, that's best case scenario. But some very brave men and women throughout history realized that the best way to spend their day today is to do something that makes tomorrow a better one. Did you notice that I'd come full circle? I sat back in the same place that I started the video in. It's like a